Welcome to Sleepy Centuries. Tonight, we will be talking about a world reborn, a time of quiet brilliance, rediscovery, and gentle revolutions. Tonight, we drift softly into the story of the Renaissance, the full journey from shadow to light, from forgotten scrolls to the brushstrokes of genius. Let your thoughts settle, your eyes grow heavy, and let us begin. It began with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the silence of something missing, something lost. A silence that stretched across generations like a fog, soft and dense. The kind of silence that follows after great things fall, after the mighty Roman Empire crumbled, after its statues were toppled, its aqueducts cracked, and its libraries burned or were left to rot. The roads still led to Rome, but fewer people walked them now. The cities emptied. The stone villas gave way to wooden huts. And the vast knowledge that once illuminated Europe, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, engineering, began to flicker and fade like a lantern in the wind. In this long night, people remembered, but they remembered only fragments. The stories of Greek heroes and Roman emperors were retold, reshaped, half forgotten, and half reinvented. A few monks in far-off monasteries, surrounded by cold stone walls and the rustle of parchment, copied ancient texts by hand, line by line, ink staining their fingers as the snow fell outside. Their work was slow and sacred, a whisper of the past echoing into the present. They preserved what they could, but they couldn't stop the forgetting. Scrolls crumbled, manuscripts disappeared. Names of great thinkers were remembered like shadows: Aristotle, Galen, Cicero. But what they said, what they taught, often remained just out of reach. Europe drifted, not asleep, but not fully awake. Kingdoms rose and fell, bound together by feudal oaths and swords. The church stood strong, like a great tree in the middle of a storm, offering structure, salvation, and sometimes silence. For many, God was the only explanation for the sun, the moon, the seasons, the sicknesses that came and went without warning, and it was enough. Curiosity was not forbidden, but it had narrow paths to walk. To ask too many questions was to risk unmooring the soul, and so, questions waited. But not everything was dark. Even in these so-called Middle Ages, beauty and knowledge found cracks to bloom through. Cathedrals rose toward the heavens, their stained glass catching the light like fire trapped in stone. Music echoed through abbey halls, each note a quiet declaration that the human spirit still longed to express, to wonder, to feel. Universities began to appear: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, where students debated the nature of God, the body, and the stars. Yet still, most learning was tethered to old frameworks, familiar doctrines. The world had a shape, and few dared redraw it. Outside of Europe, in lands that had not forgotten, the stars were still being mapped and studied. In Baghdad, Cairo, Samarkand, cities alive with markets and scholars, the works of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Hippocrates were not only preserved, they were expanded upon. While Europe slept, Islamic scholars made leaps in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry. They built observatories. They wrote poetry and philosophy in languages that flowed like rivers. They connected the old world to the new, serving as keepers of memory and inventors in their own right. Through trade routes and quiet channels, these ideas began to return to Europe, gently, almost imperceptibly. A merchant from Venice might bring back more than spices and silks: a translated manuscript, a story, a conversation overheard. Slowly, like ink spreading across parchment, new ways of thinking began to seep in. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of medieval life, ordinary people carried their own wisdom. Farmers watched the stars for signs of the harvest. Midwives passed down remedies that had roots in ancient herbal texts. Craftsmen built cathedrals without blueprints, guided by intuition and experience. There was knowledge everywhere, quiet, lived, embodied, and it was waiting for something, for a spark, for a reason to rise again. And the world was changing in other ways too. Populations grew, Towns became cities. Trade picked up along rivers and coastlines. The Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, devastating and terrifying, but it also shook the foundations of old orders. Labor became more valuable. Survivors asked deeper questions. The old certainties no longer held as tightly. The silence was thinning, and somewhere in this vast stretch of time, between forgotten empires and rising cities, between ink-stained monks and curious merchants, the first faint stirrings of a new age could be felt. Not a loud awakening, but a slow, persistent shift, like the earliest light before sunrise, barely noticeable until suddenly the sky is full of color. The Renaissance did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in, soft as breath, a book rediscovered, a statue unearthed, a scholar who began to wonder not just what the ancients had said, but why, and whether those ancient ideas could live again, not just in libraries, but in life. This is where our journey begins, not in glory or genius, but in the quiet centuries, the sleepy centuries, when the world was dreaming of light, even if it didn't yet know it. Long before the Renaissance bloomed in the cities of Europe, knowledge was already flowing elsewhere, quietly, steadily, like an underground river running beneath the surface of history. While much of the West had settled into a rhythm of tradition and faith, other parts of the world had become sanctuaries for the wisdom of the ancients. The East, particularly the vast lands of the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire, held within them something that Europe had nearly lost: memory. Memory of texts, of tools, of stars, of cures. Memory of how to think with both discipline and imagination. And from these places, whispers of forgotten brilliance began to return. In the glowing streets of Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars gathered in a place known as the House of Wisdom, a center of learning unlike anything Europe had seen for centuries. There, they translated Greek texts into Arabic, not only preserving them, but commenting, questioning, enhancing. Aristotle's logic, Galen's medicine, Euclid's geometry, all were not merely stored, but studied, reworked, and debated. Mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundation for algebra. Astronomers peered at the heavens and recorded the movements of planets with stunning precision. Physicians wrote encyclopedias of medicine that would travel across continents. And poets, theologians, and philosophers asked vast questions of the universe and the soul, blending science with spirituality, reason with wonder. Farther west, in the heart of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire stood as a living echo of Rome. Its walls had held against countless invaders, and inside those walls, Greek remained alive. The works of Plato, Hippocrates, and Archimedes remained part of intellectual life. Byzantine scribes, like their Latin counterparts, worked tirelessly to copy and preserve these ancient manuscripts. But unlike in most of Europe, they had continuous access to the original Greek texts. In their churches, mosaics shimmered with golden light. In their academies, scholars carried on traditions that linked directly to antiquity, forming a bridge between the old world and whatever was to come. Trade routes stretched like veins across the known world, and with every shipment of spices or silks, scrolls and ideas quietly traveled. In Moorish Spain, in cities like Córdoba and Toledo, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side to translate Arabic texts into Latin. It was here that Europe first encountered, once again, the deep wells of knowledge it had forgotten. These weren't sudden revelations, but slow accumulations. A manuscript translated, a letter passed, a conversation between travelers at a busy port. Little by little, the old world began to murmur again. Along the Mediterranean, ports bustled with merchants whose interests went beyond profit. Some returned home not only with rare goods, but with rare books. These texts, at first viewed as curiosities, began to circulate among the educated elite, nobles, monks, and eventually the early humanists. They were windows into another way of thinking, where logic, evidence, and human experience played central roles. Ideas that had once seemed radical, or even dangerous, were suddenly available again, offering an alternative to purely theological explanations of the world. The stars no longer had to be interpreted only through scripture. They could be measured, mapped, and understood through observation. The Crusades, brutal and tragic as they were, also played an ironic role in this exchange. European crusaders, while storming cities and building castles, came into direct contact with cultures far more advanced than their own in terms of science, medicine, and architecture. Some returned with more than war stories. They returned with questions about the design of domes, the workings of hospitals, the strange, precise instruments used to chart the skies. Curiosity had been awakened, and even if it did not immediately challenge the established order, it had begun to grow roots. Back in Europe, these foreign ideas, many of which had traveled from Greece to Arabia and now back into Latin, began to find homes in universities and libraries. They were welcomed cautiously, often examined through the lens of religion, but their impact was undeniable. Slowly, the European mind began to stretch, to remember how to ask, how to doubt, how to reach. It is important to understand that the Renaissance did not appear suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch. It was built upon centuries of careful preservation and generous transmission. It rose from the pens of Arab philosophers, the scrolls kept safe in Byzantine vaults, the voyages of traders, the curiosity of translators, and the quiet persistence of those who believed knowledge should never be buried, no matter how dangerous or inconvenient it might seem. So as Florence and Venice and Milan would later glow with new ideas and breathtaking art, they owed a silent debt to faraway places where the old world had never been forgotten. Without the East, without these centuries of gentle stewardship and fearless inquiry, the Renaissance might never have come. It was not a rebirth out of nowhere. It was a return, guided by the whispers of civilizations that never stopped thinking. And Europe, still rubbing the sleep from its eyes, was finally ready to listen. Florence did not look like the center of a revolution. Nestled in the Tuscan hills, it lay quietly along the banks of the Arno River, its red-tiled roofs glowing softly in the Italian sun. The city was ancient, but not grand like Rome. It had no empire, no towering walls of legend, no legions marching under its banner. But Florence had something else, something far more powerful for what was to come. It had wealth, it had trade, it had freedom to think, and it had people who were beginning to believe that the world could be shaped by human hands. The streets of Florence were full of motion. Artisans carved wood and stone. Merchants argued over silks and spices. Bakers shouted to one another in the morning fog. The clang of hammers and the scent of ink filled narrow alleys, and every step through the city echoed with centuries of history. But the real magic of Florence was not in the stone buildings or the crowded markets. It was in the minds of its citizens. It was a place where the old world met the new, not through conquest, but through conversation, competition, and ambition. At the heart of it all, quietly steering the city's future, stood a family whose influence would stretch far beyond their lifetimes, the Medici. The Medici were not kings, they were bankers. But in a city like Florence, wealth meant power, and power meant patronage. Cosimo de' Medici, the first great architect of the family's legacy, understood this deeply. He did not seek to rule openly. Instead, he pulled strings from behind the curtain, funding artists, architects, scholars, and philosophers. He knew that by investing in ideas, he was shaping the soul of the city. He filled libraries with manuscripts, sponsored translations of ancient Greek texts, and brought together thinkers who would later be called humanists. These men and women did not reject faith, but they shifted the focus back toward humanity, toward what people could know, what they could create, and who they could become. The Medici understood that art was more than beauty. It was a language. It could express things that words could not. And so they supported the rising stars of the time, men whose names would come to define the Renaissance. One of these was Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith turned architect who dared to dream of building a dome larger than any constructed since the ancient world. The cathedral in Florence had stood unfinished for decades, its vast octagonal base waiting, its builders baffled by how to span such a wide space without supports. Brunelleschi studied Roman ruins, sketched gears and pulleys, and defied expectation. With a combination of mathematics, engineering, and pure will, he built the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a structure so ambitious, so impossibly elegant, that it became the very symbol of Florence's awakening. But Florence was not stirred by architecture alone. In the workshops and studios that filled the city, a new kind of art was beginning to emerge. Artists no longer painted only for churches, they painted for patrons, for guilds, for the sheer joy of exploration. They painted people not as symbols, but as individuals. Faces became expressive. Bodies moved with grace and weight. Landscapes stretched into the distance, using the newly discovered rules of perspective. Light and shadow returned to the canvas, bringing depth, mood, and realism. These were not just paintings, they were mirrors to the world, filled with curiosity, emotion, and presence. In quiet rooms, scholars studied dusty volumes of Cicero, Lucretius, and Plato. They translated, debated, and sometimes disagreed with what they read. They argued that humans were not mere vessels for divine will, but rational beings capable of shaping their destinies. This was the essence of humanism, not arrogance, but hope. A belief that studying literature, philosophy, and the arts could make a better citizen, a wiser leader, a more compassionate soul. Schools began to teach not just theology, but grammar, rhetoric, poetry, and ethics. And the educated elite of Florence, many trained in the new humanist tradition, carried these ideals into government, commerce, and daily life. Florence's influence was magnetic. Artists and thinkers from across Italy came to learn, to work, to be part of something that felt like the rebirth of civilization itself. Painters like Masaccio brought breathtaking realism to biblical scenes. Sculptors like Donatello revived classical forms, giving life to bronze and marble with startling humanity. Every statue and fresco was a conversation between past and present, between myth and observation, between faith and the physical world. The city's growth was not without tension. Political rivalries flared. Religious figures warned of vanity and excess. Power shifted from family to family, and unrest sometimes rippled through the streets. But even in chaos, the city's heartbeat remained steady. It was a place that believed in building, not tearing down, in asking questions, not silencing them, in lifting the spirit, not locking it away. Florence became more than a city. It became a symbol, a living idea, a place where beauty and intellect walked hand in hand. And as its influence spread beyond Tuscany, the world began to change with it. Because what Florence had discovered, and what it quietly taught the rest of Europe, was that the past was not a tomb to be mourned, but a foundation to be built upon. That the wisdom of the ancients, blended with the imagination of the present, could illuminate paths no one had yet dreamed of. And so Florence awakened, not with trumpet blasts or grand pronouncements, but with the steady murmur of thought, the soft scrape of brush on canvas, the careful laying of stones, and the unshakable belief that a city, a culture, and a people could rise again. Before the Renaissance, the world in paintings was flat. Figures floated in golden backgrounds, eyes wide and still, with no sense of weight, no suggestion of space or depth. Art was symbolic, sacred, and distant. Icons meant to instruct, not to resemble. Time stood still on the canvas, and humanity was portrayed not as it was, but as it should be, idealized, unchanging, often identical in form. But then something changed, quietly at first. A handful of artists began to look not just at scripture, but at nature, at buildings, at light, at people walking through the streets. They studied how shadows bent around a jaw, how a hallway receded into the distance, how a person stood with one foot slightly forward, leaning into life. And for the first time in centuries, they began to draw the world as they saw it, not just as they believed it should be. What emerged was not merely art, it was a new way of seeing. It began with a problem. The Cathedral of Florence stood unfinished, capped by a vast and empty space where a dome should be. No one knew how to build it. No one had built anything like it in over 1,000 years. The ancients had done it. Rome had the Pantheon, after all, but the knowledge had been lost. Then came Filippo Brunelleschi, a man with the soul of an artist and the mind of an engineer. He had studied the ruins of Rome obsessively, sketching columns and arches, figuring out how the old builders had made stone fly. For the Dome of Florence, he proposed something bold, not just to complete it, but to do so without the wooden supports everyone thought were necessary. He would build a dome within a dome, using a herringbone pattern of bricks to support the structure as it rose. His plans were met with skepticism, even laughter. But as the years passed and the bricks climbed higher into the sky, doubt turned to awe. When it was finished, it wasn't just a feat of architecture, it was proof that the impossible could be made real through design, observation, and daring. Brunelleschi's other great contribution came not in stone, but on paper. He became obsessed with the idea of perspective, of how to depict three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Inspired by geometry and the structure of buildings, he experimented with vanishing points, horizon lines, and the mathematical rules that govern how objects shrink as they move away from the viewer. His discoveries spread through Florence like wildfire. Artists who had struggled for years to create depth now had a tool set. They began to arrange their scenes with precision, guiding the eye toward a central point, anchoring their compositions in the logic of space. The results were revolutionary. For the first time, viewers could look at a painting and feel as though they were looking into another world, a real, breathing world with depth, light, and shadow. This new perspective was not only mathematical, it was philosophical. It placed the viewer at the center of the image. It acknowledged the individual's point of view. It made art a dialogue between the artist and the observer, rather than a distant declaration. This subtle shift mirrored the humanist thinking that was reshaping education and literature. If the individual could stand at the center of a painting, why not at the center of thought, of history, of possibility? The artists who followed Brunelleschi took these ideas and pushed them further. Masaccio, one of the earliest painters to fully embrace perspective, created works with a weight and solemnity never seen before. In his fresco, The Tribute Money, figures stand in a coherent space, casting shadows, their bodies solid and proportioned. They are not saints floating in gold, they are men standing on earth. His work introduced another innovation, the use of light not just to illuminate, but to model form. Light fell across cheeks and hands, creating volume. Darkness gathered in folds of cloth and in the corners of eyes. It was subtle, but profound. And it wasn't only the human body that was returning to the canvas, it was emotion. Painters began to capture fleeting expressions, a glance, a smile, a furrowed brow. Viewers could now recognize themselves in the figures. These were no longer abstract representations of holiness or myth. These were real people, frozen in real moments, made immortal by brush and pigment. The exploration of anatomy became a central pursuit. Artists like Piero della Francesca and later Leonardo da Vinci dissected cadavers in secret, mapping bones and muscles with almost scientific precision. They sketched the twisting of torsos, the flexing of tendons, the delicate structure of the eye socket. Their notebooks were filled not just with studies for paintings, but with observations on how the body moved, how it breathed, how it reflected inner thought and feeling. The body, once considered a mere vessel for the soul, became a marvel in itself, worthy of study, of praise, of art. Buildings, too, began to reflect this new way of seeing. Renaissance architecture was not about grandeur for its own sake. It was about harmony, proportion, and balance. Inspired by Vitruvius, an ancient Roman architect, designers returned to classical orders, the column, the arch, the dome. They played with symmetry, with repeating patterns, with buildings that echoed the logic of the human body. A well-designed church or palace was like a body, each part in balance with the whole, each element contributing to a larger unity. Florence became a gallery of these new ideas, each building speaking the language of geometry and grace. As this visual revolution unfolded, it spread outward. The techniques of perspective, proportion, and anatomical accuracy traveled to other cities, to Rome, where ancient ruins whispered inspiration, to Venice, where color and light played across canals, to Northern Europe, where artists fused Renaissance realism with Gothic intricacy. Everywhere, art began to reflect a deeper curiosity about the world, not just the spiritual, but the material, the emotional, the real. And beneath it all was this quiet, radical idea that the world was worth observing, that it had order, that it had beauty, and that humans, through study and creativity, could reflect that beauty in their work. It was a shift not only in how artists painted, but in how people thought. The world was not just a test or a trial. It was a subject, a source of wonder, a thing to be known, explored, captured. This new way of seeing changed everything, not just the arts, but science, philosophy, and how people understood their place in the cosmos. The walls between disciplines grew thinner. The painter became a scientist, the architect became a philosopher. The artist was no longer a craftsman in service of the divine, but a thinker, an explorer, a voice. And with every brushstroke, every carefully calculated line, they offered a vision not just of what was, but of what could be. It was as if the world had come into focus, and once seen clearly, it could never be unseen. For centuries, the written word in Europe belonged almost exclusively to Latin, a language revered, sacred, and immovable. It was the language of the church, of law, of philosophy, of every serious thought committed to parchment. But it was not the language of the people. In fields and villages, in marketplaces and homes, people spoke in dialects rich with rhythm and emotion. Their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, they lived in languages that had no place in official texts. The divide between spoken word and written word was wide. But slowly, as if stirred by the same winds that were bringing new ideas into the light, something remarkable began to happen. Writers began to look not just to the heavens or to the authority of Rome, but to the world around them, and they began to write in the language they heard every day. The Renaissance was not only a visual awakening, it was a literary one, and it began with voices daring to speak in the tongue of their own people. In Florence, the same city that saw Brunelleschi's dome rise to the sky, a poet named Dante Alighieri took an extraordinary step. He chose to write not in Latin, but in the Tuscan dialect, the language spoken in the streets beneath his window. His epic poem, The Divine Comedy, was not only a masterpiece of literature, it was a bold declaration that poetry could be written for everyone, not just the learned elite. With each line, Dante led his readers through hell, purgatory, and paradise, guided by the Roman poet Virgil, and then by his beloved Beatrice. But the journey was more than spiritual. It was philosophical, political, deeply human. It confronted sin, justice, love, and the very shape of the soul, and it did so in a voice that his fellow citizens could understand. The decision was revolutionary. It elevated the vernacular to literary heights, and in doing so, began to unify the Italian language. Other writers soon followed, and a new age of expression was born. Among them was Petrarch, a scholar and poet who is often called the father of humanism. Like Dante, Petrarch revered the classical past, but he sought to merge ancient wisdom with a new, personal voice. He explored not just historical and philosophical subjects, but the landscape of the inner world. His sonnets to Laura, real or imagined, revealed a mind moved by longing, beauty, melancholy, and the ache of time passing. Petrarch believed that writing should not only instruct, but also move the soul. He kept careful letters, wrote passionate essays, and began the long process of collecting and restoring ancient manuscripts scattered across Europe. He wandered through dusty monasteries, scouring shelves for forgotten works of Cicero and Livy. His efforts would inspire generations of scholars to dig deeper into the remnants of the classical world, piecing together a picture of antiquity that had all but vanished. Then came Boccaccio, another Florentine whose Decameron would capture an entirely different side of the human experience. Written during the aftermath of the Black Death, the book presents a series of stories told by a group of young people who flee the plague-ravaged city to wait out the horror in the countryside. There, in a secluded villa, they pass the time by telling tales, 10 stories a day for 10 days, 100 stories in total. These stories range from the bawdy and humorous to the tragic and philosophical. They are windows into the complexities of human nature, greed, love, betrayal, wit, kindness, cruelty, and like Dante, Boccaccio wrote in the language of the people. His characters spoke as real people spoke, with all the messiness, charm, and contradiction of daily life. The Decameron showed that even in times of fear and death, laughter and storytelling could endure. It offered not a moral sermon, but a reflection of life, as it was lived, raw, unpredictable, and deeply human. These writers did more than entertain. They laid the foundation for a new literary culture, one that valued personal experience, emotional honesty, and the beauty of common speech. In doing so, they gave rise to a deeper shift. Literacy began to expand. Books written in local languages reached wider audiences. Ideas were no longer the exclusive domain of the priest or the professor. They could now be shared in taverns, homes, and marketplaces. The written word became more democratic, more alive. This literary revolution was not confined to Italy. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer drew inspiration from Boccaccio and others to write the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. His characters, pilgrims on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, spoke with voices from every corner of society: knights, millers, nuns, merchants, scholars. Each tale was rich with irony, insight, and colour. Chaucer's use of the vernacular allowed English to emerge as a legitimate literary language. Across Europe, in France, in Spain, in the German states, writers began to explore the power of their own languages. They created stories and poems that reflected their landscapes, their values, their people. What made this movement so powerful was not only the change in language, but the change in focus. Human stories took center stage. Literature was no longer only about saints and kings. It was about lovers, travelers, merchants, widows, jokers, dreamers. Writers explored the mind, the heart, the private self. Diaries, letters, essays, autobiographies, all began to appear as new forms. People were no longer just characters in a divine play. They were protagonists in their own unfolding narratives. At the same time, translations of ancient texts multiplied. Humanist scholars worked tirelessly to bring the classics into the hands of modern readers, not in Latin, but in the vernacular. Philosophy, ethics, natural science, all were slowly becoming more accessible, and with each book copied or printed, the circle of understanding widened. Language is how we define the world. To write in the voice of the people was to claim that their world mattered, that their fears, joys, and questions were worthy of preservation. The Renaissance, in this way, was not just a return to the past, it was a reaching outward, a step towards something more inclusive. It turned literature into a mirror, and in that mirror, readers could see not only gods and kings, but themselves. This new voice of the people, bold, reflective, and alive, would carry forward into every corner of the Renaissance. It would inform how laws were written, how education was shaped, how identity was understood, and once it had spoken, it could not be silenced. The world had found its tongue, and with it, it began to tell its story anew. In dimly lit workshops and soaring chapels, in city squares and dusty studios tucked behind bustling streets, a new kind of creation began to stir, a vision so vivid, so alive, that it seemed to breathe from the walls. The Renaissance painter was no longer simply an artisan who followed orders or replicated sacred forms. He was becoming something else entirely, an explorer of the visible world, a philosopher with a brush, a master of light. And as their hands moved across canvas and plaster, They conjured entire worlds with shadows, with gesture, with color, so luminous it seemed to transcend the material it was made of. These artists were more than skilled. They were visionary, and they weren't just painting images. They were painting light. Leonardo da Vinci, born a few miles outside of Florence, seemed to embody this transformation completely. He was not merely a painter, he was a thinker of vast dimensions. His notebooks overflowed with sketches and riddles, with mathematical calculations, botanical studies, and anatomical diagrams. He studied birds in flight, dissected cadavers in secret, and made elaborate notes written in mirrored script. He was fascinated by how water moved, how light scattered in the atmosphere, how a tendon pulled at the bone beneath the skin. To Leonardo, the world was a web of patterns waiting to be understood. When he painted, all this knowledge came through his hand in ways so subtle that it took centuries for people to fully comprehend his genius. Consider his Mona Lisa, not just a portrait, but a quiet revelation. She does not face the viewer with stiffness or formality. She turns gently, as if caught in the act of thinking. Her eyes follow without moving. Her smile, that soft, enigmatic curve, exists in a realm between joy and mystery. Leonardo painted her with delicate layers of translucent glazes, allowing light to filter through and bounce back from the underpaint, giving her skin a lifelike depth and softness no one had seen before. He called this technique sfumato, the smoky blending of tones with no hard lines, and it became his signature. Through it, he gave form to atmosphere, to breath, to soul. But Leonardo's reach extended beyond portraits. In The Last Supper, he did not simply depict a religious scene, he captured a moment, suspended in time. Each apostle reacts uniquely to Christ's quiet announcement of betrayal. Shock, denial, sorrow ripple down the table like a wave of human emotion. The setting is grounded in perspective, so precise that the vanishing point draws the eye directly to Christ, calm and centered. This was not art as decoration. It was narrative, psychology, geometry, light, all held together in harmony. Michelangelo, Leonardo's younger contemporary, was another force entirely. Where Leonardo was analytical and subtle, Michelangelo was thunder and fire. Born in Caprese, trained in Florence, and sculpted by destiny, he found in marble something eternal. He believed the figure was already inside the stone, waiting to be revealed. His David stands not as a symbol of a biblical tale, but as a towering embodiment of human potential. Muscles are taut, eyes focused, veins etched in stone, as if they pulse with life. There is no movement, yet there is tension in every fiber. He is not a boy, but a man poised in thought before action. Strength and intellect, balanced in perfect measure. And then there is the Sistine Chapel ceiling, an epic poem rendered in paint, unfurling across the sky. Michelangelo labored for years on scaffolding high above the floor, lying on his back, breathing in plaster dust, pushing his body past exhaustion. He painted not just scenes from Genesis, but the very drama of existence. Adam's languid hand, reaching toward the spark of God, became an image that would echo through time. Every figure, every fold of drapery, every burst of muscle and light was part of a vision that fused divinity and humanity, heaven and earth, into one breathtaking continuum. The ceiling is not still, it moves, it speaks, it lifts the soul. In Rome, Raphael emerged as a bridge between the intellectual grace of Leonardo and the sculptural drama of Michelangelo. His paintings radiated calm, clarity, and spiritual balance. In the School of Athens, he painted the great philosophers of the ancient world, not as ghostly relics, but as living men engaged in timeless debate. Plato points upward toward ideals. Aristotle gestures to the ground, grounding knowledge in observation. Light filters through arches, casting soft shadows on marble floors. The fresco becomes a temple to reason and harmony, where every gesture, every gaze, is composed like music. These artists did not work in isolation. They absorbed the discoveries of others, studied ancient statues and modern theories, challenged each other with boldness and subtlety. They competed, argued, borrowed, and innovated. They learned the chemistry of pigments, experimented with oils and glazes, mixed their own colors to achieve tones that glimmered like jewels. They traveled from court to court, from Florence to Milan to Rome, painting altarpieces and portraits, designing fortresses and fountains. And through it all, they brought light, literal and metaphorical, into places where shadow had lingered for centuries. Their impact was so profound because they changed how people saw the world itself. They taught viewers to notice the fall of light across a cheek, the play of shadow beneath a tree, the emotional truth in a glance. They painted not only what they knew, but what they felt. The divine became touchable. The human became sacred. Their art did not just illustrate, it revealed. It pulled back the veil. Even beyond Italy, the light spread. In the Netherlands, Jan van Eyck captured texture and atmosphere with a precision that bordered on miraculous. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer combined Italian technique with northern detail, producing prints and paintings of startling depth. Across Europe, painters began to tell stories through light and line, to render flesh and fabric, sky and soil, with empathy and insight. And so the Renaissance painter, once seen as merely a craftsman, became something more, a philosopher, a scientist, a poet in color. Their canvases, walls, and ceilings became maps of thought, of perception, of human possibility. They reminded the world that art was not merely about beauty, it was about vision. It was about translating the chaos of life into something that could be held, examined, remembered. In every flicker of light they captured, there was a spark of understanding, a whisper of the infinite. And in their work, we still see ourselves, not as perfect, not as fallen, but as we are, full of questions, full of wonder, lit from within. The Renaissance, for all its glory in painting and poetry, was never just about gazing inward. It was also a moment of looking outward, beyond the city walls, beyond the known world, past the edges of ancient maps that once warned, "Here be dragons." As artists were perfecting perspective, and philosophers were reviving ancient texts, ships were leaving harbors with sails full of wind and minds full of questions. This age of rediscovery soon became an age of discovery, an awakening not just of culture, but of geography, ambition, and the endless curiosity that drives people to wonder what lies beyond the horizon. For centuries, Europe had imagined the world in certain terms. The earth was fixed, ordered, limited. Jerusalem lay at the center of many medieval maps. The oceans were mysterious barriers, filled with monsters and myth. Travel was slow, dangerous, often circular. Merchants might reach Constantinople or Alexandria, but few ventured beyond. The Silk Road carried goods and whispers of distant wonders, but the East remained largely unknowable. Africa was drawn as a mystery, Asia as a dream, and the Americas as nothing at all. Yet something had shifted. With the rebirth of classical knowledge and the rise of independent city-states hungry for trade, the Renaissance created not only the means, but the mindset to challenge those old borders. Technology played its quiet, crucial part. The magnetic compass, improved in the late Middle Ages, allowed sailors to navigate with greater confidence. Advances in shipbuilding led to faster, sturdier vessels like the caravel, light enough to sail against the wind, strong enough for long voyages. Portolan charts, with their crisscrossing lines and coastal details, replaced the symbolic medieval mappa mundi. Mathematics was applied to navigation with a precision never seen before. Renaissance thinkers weren't just dreaming, they were measuring, plotting, designing. The world, once shrouded in uncertainty, began to unfold like a scroll. And so they sailed. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic, seeking a route to Asia and instead encountering a land unknown to his European maps. To those who lived in the Americas, of course, the land was not unknown at all. It was ancient, sacred, full of people and civilizations. But to Renaissance Europe, it was a new chapter, unimagined and irresistible. In the decades that followed, explorers like Amerigo Vespucci, Ferdinand Magellan, Vasco da Gama, and Hernán Cortés pushed ever farther, mapping coastlines, meeting cultures, building empires, often with awe, often with violence, always with consequence. Magellan's expedition circled the globe, proving for the first time through action what scholars like Ptolemy had once theorized, that the earth was indeed round and vast beyond comprehension. Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, connecting Europe with India by sea and opening trade routes that would shift global power for centuries. These voyages were brutal, filled with risk and ambition, sometimes glory, often destruction, yet they changed how Europeans understood the planet. Suddenly, the world was not a fixed circle. It was a sphere, wide and turning, filled with people, landscapes, and knowledge that Europe had barely imagined. With each voyage, cartographers revised their maps. Coastlines bent and stretched, islands appeared, continents took shape. A slow revolution in thinking occurred. The world was not what they had been told. It was richer, stranger, and more intricate than any story could capture. And just as important as gold or spices was what the Renaissance spirit valued most: information. Observations of plants and animals, notes on stars visible from the southern hemisphere, sketches of new lands and new faces, all flowed back to Europe. The age of exploration became an age of documentation. Travel logs, illustrated journals, detailed charts, and comparative studies became part of the growing collection of human knowledge. The desire to know, to see, to understand the world was no longer confined to the monastery or the scholar's desk. It had become a voyage. This great expansion of geography also expanded the imagination. Writers began to envision worlds beyond their shores, not only as places of trade or conquest, but as mirrors. In Thomas More's Utopia, a fictional island society was used to critique the failings of Europe itself. In travel tales, both true and embellished, readers found wonder, fear, and reflection. The encounter with the wider world brought questions as well as answers. What did it mean to be civilized? Who held wisdom? Whose version of the world should be believed? Some returned from these voyages humbled. Others returned greedy, but all returned changed. The impact was not only external. As the world expanded outward, so too did the boundaries of thought. Astronomy, once chained to Ptolemaic models of concentric crystal spheres, began to unravel. Copernicus, deeply influenced by Renaissance mathematics and humanist critique, proposed a radical idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but simply one planet orbiting the Sun. This sun-centered model didn't just rearrange the stars, it challenged the structure of belief itself. If the Earth was not central, then perhaps neither was mankind. If the heavens could be questioned, so too could the assumptions of power, of destiny, of truth. The Renaissance was now cosmopolitan. In the truest sense, it was a worldview being remade in real time. Through trade, exploration, diplomacy, and conflict, Europe began to see itself not as an isolated cradle of civilization, but as part of a broader, interconnected human tapestry. Goods, languages, customs, and ideas flowed across oceans and deserts. The compass and the canvas, the scholar and the sailor, the merchant and the mathematician, all moved in parallel, driven by a shared hunger to reach, to know, to see. And yet, this expansion came at a cost. Entire civilizations would be destroyed by the same forces that carried art and science across the sea. Empires rose not only through learning, but through conquest. The Renaissance, for all its brilliance, carried shadows with it. The Age of Light was also an age of colonization, of extraction, of loss. The same spirit of curiosity that built cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts also drove the hunger for dominion. It is important to remember that the Renaissance's great journeys were double-edged, full of awe, full of consequence. Still, in every map redrawn, in every new star charted, there remained a constant thread, the belief that the world could be known. That through experience, observation, and reason, humankind could come to understand the universe, not as a fixed mystery, but as a discoverable whole. The Renaissance had begun with a rediscovery of the past. It now stretched boldly into the future. The old borders were fading. The horizon was no longer an end. It was an invitation. And across oceans and ages, that invitation still echoes. It is hard to imagine now, in a world where information flows in endless streams, just how rare and precious a book once was. In the centuries before the Renaissance reached its height, books were handmade treasures. A single copy of a manuscript might take months, even years to complete, copied line by scribes, bent over desks in the quiet of monasteries. The parchment had to be prepared, the ink carefully mixed, the script painstakingly inked in clean, even lines, sometimes adorned with gold leaf and tiny illustrations no larger than a fingernail. Each book was an object of devotion, of patience, of reverence, and because of the sheer labor required to produce one, books were few, expensive, guarded, often locked away in chained libraries or the private collections of princes and bishops. If a scholar wanted to read the works of Plato or Cicero, he might have to travel days, weeks, or write dozens of letters just to gain access. Knowledge moved slowly, as if walking through deep snow. But then, something extraordinary happened. The Renaissance had already stirred the desire for ancient wisdom and new expression. Now, it found a voice louder and faster than anything before. And that voice was the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz in Germany, didn't set out to change the world with philosophy or art. His brilliance was mechanical. His invention, around 1440, was based on an old idea, pressing ink onto paper using a carved surface. But Gutenberg introduced a radical improvement: movable type. Instead of carving each page of text into a single block, he created individual letters that could be rearranged, reused, and locked into a frame. This simple shift transformed printing from a craft into a system. Suddenly, a single press could produce hundreds of pages a day, each one identical to the last. It was precise, repeatable, and revolutionary. The first major book Gutenberg printed was the Latin Bible, now known as the Gutenberg Bible. Beautifully set, richly illustrated, and monumental in scope, it stood as a bridge between old and new. Its form echoed the illuminated manuscripts of the past, but its method pointed to the future. The printing press did not just copy books, it multiplied them. A text that once existed in 3 copies might now exist in 300. And once a book could be made that quickly, it could be sold more cheaply, placed in the hands of merchants, students, and ordinary citizens. Literacy began to grow. Not explosively, not overnight, but steadily. The gatekeepers of knowledge found themselves facing an open door. In the decades that followed, printing presses spread across Europe. In Venice, Aldus Manutius developed pocket-sized books with legible typefaces that could be carried easily, marking the birth of portable reading. In Basel, Nuremberg, and Paris, presses churned out not only religious texts, but also classical literature, scientific treatises, mathematical tables, maps, songbooks, poetry, and plays. A new generation of printers and publishers emerged, not only as businessmen, but as curators of knowledge. They decided what would be printed, which texts would be revived, which commentaries would accompany them. Their choices shaped thought across an entire continent. With the printed word came a new intellectual landscape. Humanist scholars who had spent their lives painstakingly copying and comparing manuscripts now had tools to share their findings more widely. The writings of Petrarch, Erasmus, and Boccaccio reached audiences they never could have imagined. Arguments could be disseminated, ideas could be tested, responses could be printed in return. The printing press didn't just spread knowledge, it sped up conversation. It made it possible for people across vast distances to think together, argue, reflect, and refine. Religious change, too, found fuel in the printed word. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517, it was not the act of nailing that mattered, it was the act of printing. His theses were rapidly reproduced and circulated, translated into vernacular languages, passed from hand to hand. The Reformation may have begun with a challenge to church authority, but it spread through ink. Pamphlets, sermons, and tracts poured from presses like water, and for the first time in centuries, religious ideas became the subject of public debate among lay people, not just theologians. This wasn't just about rebellion, it was about literacy, participation, the power to read and decide for oneself. The effect of the press rippled through every corner of Renaissance life. Scientists began to publish their findings with diagrams and equations, no longer fearing that their work would be misunderstood or lost. Astronomers like Copernicus and later Galileo relied on printed books to explain their theories about the heavens. Maps were refined and printed for explorers. Legal codes and contracts became standardized. Music could now be printed in notation, allowing melodies to travel beyond their composers. Recipes, medicinal guides, manuals on farming, all found their way into print, giving rise to a new practical literature that shaped daily life as much as high art ever did. For writers, the press brought new possibilities and new pressures. A poet who once wrote for the patronage of a nobleman could now write for an audience of thousands. Plays, once ephemeral performances, could be preserved in print and studied across generations. Readers, too, began to shift. The act of reading moved from public recitation to private reflection. A person with a book in hand had access to worlds, to voices long dead, to distant lands and far-off times. This intimacy with the text, this solitude of thought, was quietly transformative. It allowed for individual judgment, interpretation, and sometimes dissent. And yet, the printing press did not destroy the old ways. Manuscripts continued to be copied. Illuminated books remained prized objects. Oral storytelling, song, and performance thrived. But printing added something new, an accelerant, a democratizer, a force that echoed the Renaissance's deepest faith, that knowledge should not be confined, but shared. That beauty and truth, once uncovered, belonged to the many, not the few. The written word, once chained to pulpits and podiums, now traveled in wagons, crossed mountains, passed through markets and towns. The press turned every printed page into a lantern, and as they spread, one by one, they lit 1,000 minds. The Renaissance had found its wings, and those wings were made of type, of paper, of ink that refused to fade. In every book printed, there was the promise of thought made lasting, of voices carried forward, of a world more connected by ideas than by borders. It was not just a change in how books were made. It was a change in how people lived, how they learned, how they dreamed, and it would never be reversed. The Renaissance gave rise to wonders, the great paintings, the domes of marble, the rebirth of ancient ideas. But beneath the glowing surface of beauty and invention, there was something more subtle, something slower and more patient taking root, a quiet rebellion. Not a rebellion of swords or shouting, but of ink and thought. A rebellion not against power alone, but against silence. In the lecture halls of universities, in the private studies of scholars, in corners of bustling cities, and even behind the pulpits of churches, thinkers began to speak with a new tone, careful, measured, and yet revolutionary. These were not men who shattered the old world in dramatic acts. They were readers, writers, and dreamers who asked hard questions in gentle ways. They didn't burn books, they wrote them, and in their quiet defiance, they reshaped how Europe thought about truth, about law, about faith, and about itself. One of the most enduring figures of this intellectual turning point was Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. Born in the late 15th century, Erasmus moved among the courts and libraries of Europe like a pilgrim of wisdom. He was a scholar of the classics, a master of Latin and Greek, and an outspoken critic, not of religion itself, but of the way it had been wielded. He believed deeply in the moral teachings of Christ, but he despaired at how far the church had drifted from those ideals. In his In Praise of Folly, a brilliant and biting satire, he used humor and irony to expose the vanity, corruption, and absurdity of those in power, both secular and sacred. It was not a savage attack, but a mirror, held up for all to see the ways in which wisdom had been replaced by pomp and truth buried beneath ceremony. Erasmus didn't shout. He invited laughter, and in that laughter, reflection. He urged a return not just to the texts of ancient Rome and Greece, but to the teachings of the New Testament, stripped of ritual, grounded in compassion, lit by reason. His dream was of reform, not revolt, but his words, printed and passed from hand to hand, lit fires he could not have foreseen. While Erasmus sought reform through reason, Thomas More dreamed of something deeper, a different kind of society entirely. In his book Utopia, More imagined an island where justice was not a tool of the powerful, where wealth was shared, where people lived in harmony, not under constant war or poverty. It was fiction, and yet not. A philosophical mirror, a conversation about what might be possible if greed and ambition were not the engines of politics. More himself was a statesman, deeply involved in the machinery of English government, and eventually martyred for refusing to betray his conscience under King Henry VIII. But in his writing, he dared to propose a world beyond what had ever been attempted, a society ruled not by dogma, but by equity, a place where people lived simply, governed themselves wisely, and placed virtue above pride. It was, as the title suggested, no place, but also every place that might yet be. Utopia was not just a dream. It was a question posed to every reader. Why not something better? In Italy, where the Renaissance had first flourished, another voice emerged, darker, sharper, and far less idealistic. Niccolò Machiavelli, a diplomat and political theorist, wrote not about what the world should be, but what it was. In The Prince, he stripped politics of illusion. Power, he argued, was not gained or held by virtue alone. A ruler must be willing to deceive, to manipulate, to act decisively, even cruelly, if necessary. The goal was stability, survival, order. He did not celebrate tyranny, but he observed with brutal clarity how states were made and lost. His work scandalized many, especially those who believed that morality and governance must walk hand in hand. But Machiavelli was not merely cynical. Beneath his pragmatic surface was a desire to understand the mechanics of leadership, to teach how a fragile state could endure in a chaotic world. His writing marked a departure from medieval idealism. No longer were kings judged solely by divine right or piety, but by their results, their choices, their ability to adapt. The Prince was not a blueprint for tyranny. It was a mirror for rulers who had no gods left to guide them. What connected these thinkers was not agreement. Erasmus, More, and Machiavelli had vastly different visions of society, of virtue, of human nature, but what united them was their method. They wrote boldly but carefully. They used ancient sources but applied them to the present. They questioned the assumptions that had governed thought for centuries, and they offered new ways of thinking about ethics, about authority, about what it meant to live a good life. Their books were read not just by scholars, but by princes, clergy, merchants, even soldiers. Their ideas bled into policy, into law, into the private reflections of thousands. They didn't need to lead armies. Their armies were made of words. And there were others. In Spain, Bartolomé de las Casas began to write about the horrors he witnessed in the New World, the exploitation and brutality inflicted upon indigenous peoples by European colonizers. His voice, anguished and insistent, called for a rethinking of conquest, of empire, of human dignity. In France, Michel de Montaigne began to explore the self in a new way, writing essays that meandered through memory, emotion, and personal doubt. He did not pretend to be perfect or all-knowing. He wrote to understand himself, and in doing so, opened a door for others to do the same. It was a subtle revolution. A man sitting at his desk, questioning everything, not to destroy, but to see clearly. These were the gentle rebels of the Renaissance. They carried no flags, they started no wars, but they shifted the ground beneath the feet of Europe. Their rebellion was not destruction, it was illumination. They believed that the world could be better, not through force, but through understanding. They believed that minds could be changed, that truths could be revealed slowly, patiently, through reason and dialogue. They wrote in Latin and in vernacular, in satire and in sorrow, in polemic and in poetry. Their work did not always find a comfortable home. Some were censored, some were condemned, some were misunderstood, but they endured because their ideas were rooted in something deeper than fashion or politics. They were rooted in conscience. The Renaissance had begun as a rediscovery. These thinkers made it into a reckoning. They asked, if we know more, should we not also do better? If we have recovered the wisdom of the ancients, how do we apply it to the confusions of the present? If we can imagine better worlds, why do we tolerate the broken ones we live in? These questions did not end when the Renaissance faded. They echo still, in every essay, every novel, every attempt to understand the self and the society we build. The gentle rebels of the Renaissance whispered, when others shouted, and in those whispers, the foundations of modern thought were laid. By the early 1600s, the Renaissance had reached its twilight. It did not end in a single moment, or with a grand declaration. It faded like a day turning into dusk, slowly, subtly, as new lights began to glimmer on the horizon. The questions that had awakened in Florence, in Rome, in Venice and beyond were no longer confined to the hands of artists and philosophers. They had taken root in cities and universities, in courts and among commoners, carried by the printed word and the currents of exploration. The Renaissance had transformed how Europe saw itself, how it understood its past, its potential, and the possibilities of the human spirit. But as with all great movements, the very changes it set in motion began to push it forward into new forms, into new centuries, into new revolutions of thought. What had begun as a return to the ancients had opened the door to something altogether more radical, the invention of the modern world. The final chapters of the Renaissance were not quiet ones. They were filled with brilliance and tension, with masterpieces and the early cracks of new conflicts. The world was larger now, both in geography and in intellect. Ideas no longer flowed in one direction, from the church to the people, from authority to listener, but in every direction at once. This brought energy, but it also brought contradiction. The harmony that Renaissance thinkers once dreamed of, where art and science, faith and reason moved together like dancers, began to strain under the weight of so much change. The questions had grown too big, the discoveries too disruptive, the ambitions too vast to remain within the polished ideals of classical balance. In art, the final bloom of the Renaissance was stunning. Caravaggio brought drama and darkness to the canvas, painting ordinary people as saints, showing apostles with dirty feet and weathered faces, bathed in harsh, divine light. His chiaroscuro, his manipulation of shadow and illumination, made the sacred raw and immediate. Meanwhile, Artemisia Gentileschi, painting in the wake of violence and struggle, turned biblical heroines into figures of strength and defiance, their gazes steady, their hands sure. The art of this later period did not idealize. It confronted. It told stories not just of beauty, but of pain, of courage, of truth seen up close. Architecture, too, evolved. The clean symmetry of Brunelleschi gave way to the ornate grandeur of Baroque design. Churches, palaces, and public spaces swelled with movement, decoration, theatricality. Bernini carved marble into flesh that rippled with motion and emotion. His ecstasy of Saint Teresa did not depict holiness as stillness, but as a moment of transcendence, trembling, alive. The Renaissance had given the tools, and the Baroque used them to reach higher, to stretch the limits of what could be expressed in stone and light. And in science, the changes were even more profound. Galileo Galilei, once a young admirer of the classical world, pointed his telescope to the night sky and found a cosmos that defied ancient maps. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, not the Earth. He saw mountains on the moon, sunspots on the sun, imperfections in the heavens that had once been thought divine and unchanging. When he argued that the earth itself moved, he was met with resistance, not only because his findings challenged scripture, but because they shifted the center of everything. His trial, his forced silence, his whispered words, "A pour s'y mouve, and yet it moves," marked a turning point. The Renaissance had opened the door to inquiry, but now, inquiry was beginning to threaten the very foundations upon which much of Europe had built its truths. Philosophers followed suit. René Descartes, writing from the stillness of early modern Europe, asked not what had been known in the past, but what could be certainly known. He stripped away assumption after assumption until only one truth remained: cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. From this starting point, a new kind of thought would grow, no longer dependent on tradition or revelation, but rooted in doubt, in logic, in the individual's capacity to reason. This was not the Renaissance of Raphael's balance or Michelangelo's heroism. This was the beginning of a new world, one in which certainty was pursued not through memory, but through method. Even literature shifted. William Shakespeare, writing in the late 16th and early 17th century, brought the Renaissance obsession with the self to its highest form. His plays were filled with characters who questioned, who reflected, who doubted. Hamlet, standing alone with his thoughts, becomes the symbol of this new, introspective human. Not a saint, not a king, but a man torn between action and thought, struggling with meaning, morality, mortality. Shakespeare did not offer easy answers. He offered mirrors, flawed, glittering, and haunting. And so, as the Renaissance came to a close, it left behind not a finished work, but a foundation. Its legacy was not a single idea, but the capacity for ideas to grow, to change, to challenge. The world it handed to the next age was more curious, more connected, more complicated. The harmony it once sought gave way to tension, and in that tension, new creativity was born. The Enlightenment would rise next, carrying forward the torch of reason. Revolutions would follow, political, scientific, industrial, and the questions that had first stirred in Florence's libraries and artists' studios would echo on. The Renaissance did not end. It transformed. Its artists taught us to see. Its writers taught us to ask. Its thinkers taught us to wonder not only at the stars, but at the spaces between them, at the silence before the question. In its golden age, it turned its gaze backward to reclaim the past. But in doing so, it gave the future a path forward, a path made not of dogma, but of inquiry, not of certainty, but of searching. And as the candlelight dimmed in those grand halls, as the final strokes of fresco dried on chapel walls, as the presses cooled and the ships returned from distant lands, the world looked different. Not because it had changed entirely, but because people had. They had learned to see with new eyes, to hear with open minds, to speak not only what they were told, but what they had discovered for themselves. The Renaissance had not merely rebirthed knowledge, it had awakened the soul of inquiry. And so it lingers, quietly, like music after the last note, not gone, but absorbed into everything that followed, into the way we write, and think, and dream, into every question we ask when we stare at the stars, or pick up a book, or imagine a better world. The Renaissance was never just a moment in time. It was, and is, a turning of the mind toward the light.